right, welcome back, everyone. We are here for probably the most important diagram that not only that we've covered so far, but in economics, we're going to put supply and demand on the same diagram, and specifically, we're going to get into this idea of a competitive market equilibrium. So maybe a good starting point is to think about what this idea of equilibrium is as a concept, right? So some synonyms that people often associate with the word equilibrium would be sort of balance, right? But it would be a good idea to sort of borrow some knowledge from our friends in the natural sciences to think about what this word equilibrium means. So in physics, Newton's first law of motion says that when an object is at rest, it will remain at rest until it's acted upon by an outside force, right? So when something is in balance or it's in equilibrium, then that simply means it has no tendency to move, right? And in a physical sense, it's usually sort of met by two opposing forces. So right now I'm recording this video on an iPad. That iPad is being pulled down by the force of gravity, but also pushed up with equal force by the table that it is standing on, right? So it is in balance. It will keep sitting there, hopefully, throughout this video unless something comes along and moves it. So in economics, the idea of equilibrium just simply means that supply and demand are sort of equal to one another, and they will stay there until acted upon by an outside force. Now, those outside forces, in this case, are determinants of supply and determinants of demand. Now, for this video, we're only going to talk about shifts of demand, right? We're going to show an increase in demand and a decrease of demand here. So we will cover supply shifts in a separate video, but specifically we're going to try to get into the ideas of excess demand or excess supply, or a shortage or a surplus, right? Because when supply or demand shift, that changes our equilibrium. So in terms of a market, a good way to think about a price equilibrium is that is the price until supply or demand change, but that is the price that both consumers and producers agree on, right? At this price, right, consumers would probably want to buy for cheaper, right? Law of demand. Consumers want to buy for a lower price. Producers would like to sell for a higher price because of the law of supply. But at some point, we reach an equilibrium where the consumer and the producer will agree, and then some sort of transaction happens. So the market we're going to think about here is MacBook laptops, okay? So to illustrate an increase in demand here, our example is going to be COVID-19 shifting a lot of our learning, and that happening actually online instead. So what would that do to the market for MacBooks, right? That would increase the demand for MacBooks because of a change of tastes or preferences. Since all of this learning is happening online, maybe those people who needed a new MacBook had to go out and buy one, or families sort of needed more than one computer or something like that. So that has increased the demand for lots of different types of electronics. So we're going to do this, we're going to show this, just as we always did in our previous video here, that we're going to show a pretty healthy increase in demand here. Okay, so far we know how to do that. Let's put some arrows on it to show the shift. So at this new level of demand, we now have the problem of excess demand because the price mechanism has not had a chance to change yet. So if we were to connect this price over, at this point, we're going to call that Q2. If the price was not allowed to change, we would have a shortage. This distance here, we're going to say that's a shortage. Or in other words, everyone who wants to buy a MacBook at that price cannot do so because not enough of them are being produced. This is the quantity supplied. This is the quantity demanded at demand 2, right? So another way to say this is at a price of PE1, we have excess demand. And now we're going to get into Adam Smith's idea of an invisible hand guiding the market. He was talking about the idea of the price mechanism. So how do we solve this problem of having too many computers demanded and too few supplied at this price? Well, eventually, Apple, as a producer, will realize that they're selling out of their computers way too fast, and that they'll have customers coming into the store or trying to buy online, and there'll just be no computers in the inventory. And they might think, I bet we could get away with selling our computers at a higher price, right? So when Apple realizes there's been an increase in demand, they will raise their prices, and that will incentivize them to make more computers. And for those people who make up the demand at D2, because of the law of demand, fewer people will want to buy computers. And from the law of demand, we will know that as the price increases, the quantity demanded will increase. So as price increases, it will eventually get to the point where we have a new equilibrium. So they will eventually raise their prices to the point where the new demand curve hits our pre-existing supply curve, and we're going to call this point QE2. Okay, so we've had a shift of equilibrium. A force has come along, and it has moved our demand curve from one point to another. All right, and then we also have a new price equilibrium. So if you want to buy a new MacBook, you're going to have to pay a higher price because there's now a greater number of consumers who want to buy that computer. And Apple has realized this, so they know they can raise their prices, right? So what happened here? From PE1, we had the problem of excess demand. When Apple raises their prices, fewer people will want to buy, and Apple will want to make more of them, and will eventually arrive at a new price equilibrium where a greater number of computers are sold at a higher price. That's good news for Apple, maybe not such great news for the consumer. Okay, so let's get to how to illustrate a decrease of demand. All right, so the example I'm going to give you here is the Google Chrome books hit the market. Now, Google Chromebooks are not as good of a computer as MacBooks, but they are a reasonable substitute. So, those computers are of a lower price, right? They're a lower priced substitute, and they have eaten into the demand a little bit for MacBooks, right? So this was the market before Google Chromebooks hit the scene, right? But when those cheaper substitutes hit the market, we're going to have a decrease in demand for MacBooks. And again, we'll show that in red here. And put an arrow on there to show the shift. So similar to when we showed an increase in demand, when we show a decrease in demand, we're going to have a price equilibrium problem to start. At this new demand curve, if we assume that the initial price stays there, we're going to have a resource allocation problem again. All right, so here, instead of having a shortage, as in everyone who wanted to buy a MacBook at that price cannot find one to actually buy, here we're going to have the idea of a surplus. which is to say that Apple will have a bunch of unsold MacBooks just kind of sitting around in their stores. They'll have a whole bunch of inventory, and that's very wasteful as a business, right? So, another way to say that, instead of saying we have excess demand at that price, now over here we have the problem of excess supply at a price of PE1. Now, Apple, being a pretty smart company, they will catch on pretty quickly that because there's a new competitor on the scene, they can no longer charge this price, and they're going to have to drop their price because no one wants to buy those computers at that price. Okay, so again, what will they do? Right, at this price here, we have the problem of excess supply, or we have unsold MacBooks just sitting around. Eventually, Apple will realize they need to lower their prices, and when they do that, that will decrease the quantity supplied, and that will simultaneously increase the quantity demanded because of the law of demand and the law of supply. Now, eventually, Apple will drop their prices to the point where we get a new price equilibrium here and a new quantity equilibrium there. Okay? So this is the idea of the price mechanism. Whenever supply or demand changes, our initial price will change, and it has to change because there will be an imbalance in the market, and a change in the price will either increase or decrease the quantity supplied depending on what's happening in our curves there. Okay, so in our next video we're going to show shifts of supply. Thanks, guys.